Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today we're exploring a case where an ordinary walk across the New Mexico desert uncovered one of the largest suspected serial murder scenes in modern American history.
It really forces a complete reevaluation of the spaces we inhabit.
Yeah.
You know, when an entire landscape is just concealing something of this magnitude.
Yeah.
The ground beneath your feet suddenly feels less like a solid foundation and more like a curtain.
Right. And to understand how that curtain was pulled back, we really have to travel to February 2009. We're on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Which is an incredibly unique landscape.
It really is. For anyone unfamiliar with the geography of the American Southwest, the West Mesa is this massive, elevated volcanic plateau bordering the western edge of the city.
Yeah, you've got the Sandia Mountains looming to the east.
Exactly. And to the west, just this sprawling, stark expanse of dirt, sagebrush, and deep natural drainage channels that they call arroyos.
Right, it's a harsh environment. I mean, you can stand out there, see the entire skyline of a major metropolitan area in the distance, and still feel completely isolated from the rest of humanity.
Which is terrifying when you think about it.
That isolation is a critical feature of the terrain, though. The mesa provides this sort of psychological buffer.
Because you're so close to the city but completely hidden.
Exactly. You are near urban infrastructure, but the sheer vastness of the brush creates an illusion of complete invisibility. It's a landscape that just absorbs secrets.
And on this specific winter day in 2009, a local woman was taking advantage of that quiet. She was out walking her dog through an undeveloped stretch of the mesa.
Just a normal afternoon.
Right. And her dog started sniffing around this particular patch of dirt, and she noticed something protruding from the earth.
Which out there isn't always an immediate red flag.
No, not at all. Finding a bone in the desert is practically a daily occurrence. You have coyotes, stray livestock, natural wildlife decay everywhere. But she paused.
Because she noticed the morphology of the bone.
Yeah, it didn't look right.
No. A coyote femur, or say a sheep bone, has a very different scale and density compared to a human bone.
Right.
The object sticking out of the sand was large, robust, and unmistakably resembling a human femur. So rather than just writing it off as animal remains, she called the authorities.
And her decision to make that phone call unraveled an absolute nightmare.
It really did.
When forensic units arrived to secure what they assumed was just, a single tragic crime scene, the scope of the discovery shifted almost immediately.
Because as they began to clear the topsoil, the grid just kept expanding.
Right. They weren't just looking at one victim.
No, the initial recovery effort rapidly transformed into this massive archaeological-style excavation.
I mean, they had to bring in heavy machinery, right?
Yeah, heavy machinery that had to be carefully staged so they didn't crush anything. Forensic anthropologists were brought in with trowels, brushes, specialized screening equipment.
Wow.
They established a complex grid system across the desert floor to track every single fragment of evidence.
It's just a massive undertaking.
And over the following weeks, sifting through that alkaline soil, they unearthed a mass burial site containing the remains of 11 women and one unborn fetus.
God.
All laid out in a series of shallow graves.
11 women. It's a number that simply stops you in your tracks.
It's unfathomable.
Which brings us to the core mystery we need to examine today. And it's something I want you, the listener, to keep in mind as we navigate this investigation.
How could an entire graveyard of victims remain hidden in the dirt for years?
Exactly, right on the edge of a major American city without anyone noticing.
Well, answering that requires looking closely at the literal shifting sands of the West Mesa.
Right, because the discovery of these women is this bizarre intersection of a predator's meticulous geographic planning and honestly a complete fluke of global economics.
This is just surreal.
I want to focus on that economic fluke for a second because the mechanism of this discovery is incredible. The burial site was located near 118th Street and Dennis Chavez Boulevard.
And for years, those graves just sat completely undisturbed.
Right. And yet the catalyst that ultimately exposed this killer wasn't some brilliant detective work or a sudden confession.
No.
It was the 2008 global housing market collapse.
Which sounds completely disconnected. But the timeline of the city's expansion is exactly what set the trap.
Break that down for us.
So, in the early to mid-2000s, Albuquerque was experiencing a massive real estate boom. Developers were aggressively eyeing the West Mesa.
Buying up all that empty desert.
Right, buying massive tracts of it to build these sprawling suburban subdivisions. They had already sent out surveyors to plot the land, draw up residential streets, prepare the foundational infrastructure.
They were ready to pave over the whole area.
Exactly.
Right.
And then the 2008 housing bubble burst.
Wow.
The funding evaporated overnight. Construction just stopped dead.
It's essentially hitting the pause button on a landfill.
Yeah.
I mean, the concrete was meant to pave over this specific patch of desert permanently, but the financial crash froze the concrete mixer just seconds before the pour.
That's an excellent way to conceptualize it. But before the developers went bankrupt, they had already altered the natural topography of the land.
Right, they moved a lot of dirt around.
They had filled in and redirected a natural arroyo. And as we mentioned, an arroyo is a dry creek bed that channels massive amounts of water during these sudden, violent flash floods, typical of the high desert.
So by messing with that natural drainage path...
They inadvertently caused flooding issues for a few existing homes nearby.
Ah, of course.
So to mitigate those complaints, the developer was forced to quickly build a retaining wall and a retention pond right over the area that had been platted for future homes.
Which happens to be the exact patch of dirt where the bodies were buried.
Exactly.
But I really want to understand the physical mechanics here. How does building a retention pond cause bones buried deep in the dirt to suddenly rise to the surface? I mean, wouldn't heavy pooling water just bury them deeper in the mud?
You would naturally assume so, yeah. But desert soil chemistry dictates otherwise.
Okay.
The soil on the West Mesa is highly alkaline and contains specific types of expanding clays, like smectite.
Smectite, yeah.
Right. So when you create a retention pond, you are forcing water to pool in one spot rather than just sheet away naturally.
Oh, okay.
And when this specific clay gets wet, it expands significantly. Then, when it bakes in the desert sun and dries out, it contracts and cracks.
Oh, wow. So it creates a churning effect in the earth.
Yes, exactly. Over several years, the repeated cycle of pooling storm water expanding the soil, followed by severe drying and shrinking, essentially regurgitated the contents of the ground.
That is wild.
The soil eroded layer by layer, and the swelling action gradually pushed the largest, most buoyant objects,
The femurs.
right, the femurs upward until they literally broke the surface in 2009.
So the hydrology of the desert effectively refused to let them stay buried?
It pushed them right out.
But let me pose a deeply unsettling hypothetical here. If the economic bubble had never burst, like if the subprime mortgage crisis never happened and that developer simply kept building his subdivision in 2006, what would be at 118th Street today?
Well, satellite imagery provides a definitive answer to that.
Really?
Yeah. Archival photos from 2003 to 2005 show distinct tire marks and patches of disturbed soil exactly where the remains were later recovered.
Right, when the bodies were likely being placed there.
Exactly. And by 2006, the development infrastructure had already encroached on that specific perimeter. The site had been covered with fill dirt and officially platted for residential homes.
Oh my God.
So if the housing crash hadn't halted the construction crews, a suburban neighborhood would be sitting on top of those victims today.
People would be living right over them.
Families would be mowing their lawns, hosting barbecues, completely unaware that their foundations were poured directly over a mass grave.
That is chilling.
The evidence and any chance of closure for those families would have been permanently entombed under concrete.
That thought alone gives the entire case this suffocating weight.
Yeah.
It really makes it all the more urgent that we don't just refer to these women as remains or, forensic anomalies.
Absolutely not.
For years, their disappearances were treated as invisible, and we need to center who they were as human beings. Most of them vanished in a very tight window between 2003 and 2005.
Right. The confirmed victims recovered from the mesa include Monica Dana Candelaria, who was 22 years old, Victoria Ann Chavez, 26, Doreen Marquez, 24,
Such young women.
Veronica Romero, 28, Virginia Cloven, 24, Julie Cindy Nieto, 24, Cinnamon Elks, 32, and Gina Michelle Valdez, who was 22 years old and 4 months pregnant at the time she was murdered.
When you look at their backgrounds, you just see this heartbreaking pattern of vulnerability.
You really do.
Most were Latino women in their 20s who were battling severe addiction and navigating the intense dangers of street-level sex work along Albuquerque's Central Avenue corridor.
That was the primary victimology.
But there are victims who severely complicate the profile of whoever was hunting them. Take Solania Edwards, for example.
Right. Solania's case is a major outlier.
She was a 15-year-old runaway. She was the only Black victim found at the site, and crucially, she was the only victim from completely out of state, specifically Lawton, Oklahoma.
And her presence at the West Mesa site shatters the assumption that the offender was strictly hunting local women from the Central Avenue corridor.
Right, because Lawton, Oklahoma is hundreds of miles away.
Exactly. This indicates the offender either had an interstate reach, or, what's perhaps more likely, Solania was moved across state lines through illicit trafficking networks before she eventually crossed paths with the local killer in Albuquerque.
Which introduces a massive variable into the geographic profiling of the case.
It really muddies the waters for investigators.
And then there is the case of 15-year-old Jamie Barella, which is just devastating.
Yes, it's incredibly tragic.
Unlike the other women, Jamie had absolutely no connection to sex work, the streets, or addiction. She was just a teenager going about her life.
Completely outside the established profile.
Right. On March 26, 2004, she vanished alongside her 27-year-old cousin, Evelyn Salazar, and Evelyn's remains were also uncovered in the mass grave.
Right. And Jamie Barella's murder provides this chilling glimpse into the behavioral adaptability of the offender.
What do you mean by adaptability?
Well, Evelyn Salazar fit the primary victimology, right? She was navigating those vulnerable street environments.
Okay.
So the offender likely targeted Evelyn specifically. Jamie, however, represents collateral damage. She just happened to be with Evelyn when the predator struck.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Exactly. And rather than aborting the abduction because there was an extra person, the killer chose to murder both of them to ensure there were no witnesses. This demonstrates a terrifying situational ruthlessness. The killer was not adhering to some rigid, uncontrollable compulsion that only allowed him to kill a specific type.
He could adapt on the fly.
Yes, he was highly organized, capable of managing multiple victims simultaneously to protect his operational security.
He was a problem solver, and his solution was a double homicide. What makes this even more daunting is that the 11 women found at 118th Street do not represent the totality of the violence in that area.
Not even close.
When you analyze the missing persons reports in Albuquerque from that specific era, from roughly 2001 to 2006, the math just doesn't add up.
The discrepancy is massive. There's a secondary roster of women who fit the exact same behavioral and physical profile, who vanished from the very same stretches of Central Avenue during that identical time frame.
And they remain unaccounted for today.
Yes. We are talking about 8 to 9 additional women.
Women like Martha Lucher, Leah Peebles, and Darlene Marie Trujillo, as well as Anna Vigil, Felipa Gonzalez, Nina Herron, Jillian Ortiz Henderson, Chantel Waits, and Vanessa Reed.
All vanished without a trace.
They disappeared into thin air. If they aren't on the West Mesa, where are they?
Well, the prevailing investigative theory is that the West Mesa was not the offender's only disposal site.
He had multiple locations.
Right. The graves at 118th Street were heavily utilized between 2003 and 2005. The women who vanished in 2001 or 2006 likely met the same fate, but were placed in different geographic clusters.
Because the desert is just so vast.
The deserts surrounding Albuquerque offer hundreds of square miles of identical, isolated terrain. The West Mesa site is simply the only one that a real estate collapse managed to dig up for us.
Which is a terrifying thought. There could be other sites right now just waiting to be found.
Very likely.
Once the scale of the 118th Street discovery became public, the Albuquerque Police Department initiated a massive response. They formed a dedicated task force, utilized ground-penetrating radar across all the adjacent lots, and fielded over 1,500 tips from the public.
They threw a lot of resources at it initially.
But the investigation produced one of the most bizarre and psychologically unsettling moments in modern true crime history in December of 2010.
Ah, yes, the public photo release.
Yeah.
Is a highly unconventional and controversial tactic by law enforcement.
They released a series of photographs showing unidentified women. The police refused to state explicitly where they obtained these images, but the context made it glaringly obvious.
Right. Everyone knew what they were implying.
These photos were seized during a search warrant related to the case, and the images themselves are incredibly difficult to process. Several of the women appeared to be completely unconscious or incapacitated.
Releasing images of that nature to the general public is a last resort maneuver.
But because it's so invasive.
Because it exposes the community to the raw, unfiltered trophies of a predator. Investigators were hoping that someone, a family member, maybe a former associate, might recognize the face and provide a name.
And that name could then link back to a suspect.
Exactly. The results of that release, however, only deepened the confusion surrounding the evidence.
It completely defied expectations, because one of the women in the supposedly sinister photographs was recognized by her family.
Right.
They contacted police to confirm her identity, but they also confirmed that she had died of natural causes years earlier.
Which nobody saw coming.
No. And then, even more surprisingly, two of the other women depicted in the photos were identified as being alive and well.
Which was a massive shock to the investigation. Finding those two women alive was a double-edged sword for the task force.
How so?
Well, on the positive side, it provided living witnesses who had actually interacted with someone connected to the case file.
Right, someone they could interview.
Exactly. But on the analytical side, it proved that the evidence was heavily polluted.
Polluted?
Think about it. If a suspect possesses photographs of unconscious women, the immediate assumption is that those women are victims of homicide.
Right, that's the natural conclusion.
Discovering they survived means the photos might have been traded among a broader network of individuals, or maybe taken in contexts entirely unrelated to the West Mesa murders.
Wow, so it dilutes the value of the photos entirely.
It meant investigators could not take any piece of evidence at face value.
And that polluted evidence, combined with the fact that the physical crime scene had been baked in the desert sun for years, created this massive investigative vacuum.
A void of official answers.
Right. And whenever there is a void of answers in a case of this magnitude, the internet true crime community rushes in to fill it with speculation.
Which is inevitable.
One of the very first things the public did was assign a moniker to the unknown offender. They started calling him the West Mesa Bone Collector.
Assigning a moniker like that is a well-documented sociological response to serial violence.
It happens in almost every major case.
It serves a functional purpose by creating a recognizable brand. It optimizes the case for search engines, keeps the story anchored in the news cycle, and gives the public a neat, easily digestible focal point.
I understand the utility of it for, like, a news ticker, but I really have to question the ethics of using a name like that.
It's definitely problematic.
Does assigning a catchy Hollywood-style nickname actually assist in solving a cold case, or does it actively desensitize the public to the human tragedy?
Usually the latter.
Right. Calling him the Bone Collector focuses the entire narrative on the morbid aftermath, the literal bones in the dirt. It shifts the spotlight onto the mythology of a supervillain, while the 11 vibrant, complex women who were hunted get reduced to mere props in his origin story.
The ethical cost is significant, yes. You are highlighting the exact danger of true crime consumption.
Exactly.
When an investigation is framed as a fictional thriller, the victims are stripped of their humanity. The public becomes obsessed with unmasking the boogeyman rather than examining the societal failures that allowed the women to be taken in the first place.
And keeping the focus on the reality of the crimes, I want to break down the two major operational theories that have dominated police war rooms and online forums for the last 17 years.
Okay.
The debate essentially boils down to whether this was the work of a single, highly organized monster or an entire syndicate.
Right.
Let's start with the single serial killer theory.
Well, the single offender hypothesis is grounded heavily in behavioral and geographic consistency.
The patterns at the gravesite?
Yes. The dumping ground is highly concentrated. You have 11 bodies clustered in a relatively small patch of the West Mesa.
Right.
The burial methodology is identical across the board. Shallow graves dug into the natural topography of an arroyo.
So they were all handled the same way.
Exactly. This indicates a single offender who had developed a deeply ingrained routine and possessed an intimate familiarity with that specific isolated terrain.
He knew the exact dirt roads to take to avoid being seen by headlights from the highway.
He was entirely in his element out there.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the timeline is incredibly compressed. The vast majority of the abductions occurred within a strict 24-month window.
That's a lot of victims in a very short amount of time.
And the victimology targeting marginalized Latino women involved in street-level sex work is remarkably consistent.
Right.
So when you synthesize the concentrated geography, the identical disposal methods, the tight timeline, and the specific victim profile, the most statistically probable conclusion is a single local predator operating comfortably within his established hunting grounds.
That makes total sense. But the alternative theory, the sex trafficking ring hypothesis, also holds a terrifying amount of logical weight,
It does.
especially when you consider the geography of the American Southwest. Albuquerque isn't just a city. It is a massive transit hub situated squarely on Interstate 40.
The logistics of interstate highways are heavily utilized by organized criminal networks.
Right.
The trafficking theory posits that the West Mesa was not the private graveyard of a lone wolf, but a designated disposal site for a multi-state syndicate.
Moving people across state lines.
Yes. Investigators have mapped potential networks moving vulnerable women between hubs like Las Vegas, Nevada, El Paso, Texas, Killeen, Texas, and Denver, Colorado.
And Albuquerque acts as the central node connecting all those routes.
Precisely.
And these rings don't just operate randomly, right? They follow the money and the crowds.
They meticulously track large-scale events. The New Mexico State Fair, for instance, brings a massive influx of tourists, transient workers, and cash into Albuquerque.
Perfect cover.
It provides the perfect chaotic cover for a trafficking network to move victims in and out of the city without drawing attention.
Right.
Proponents of this theory suggest the West Mesa victims were collateral damage of this illicit industry, and the burial site was simply the local branch's designated landfill.
Okay, but let me push back on the trafficking ring theory using the geographic logic we just discussed.
Well,
If you are an incredibly sophisticated, multi-state organized crime syndicate utilizing interstate highways, why would you establish a concentrated mass grave right in your own backyard, practically within city limits?
that is the exact counter-argument.
I mean, an organized ring would likely scatter remains across hundreds of miles of remote desert to avoid generating local heat. Putting 11 bodies in one spot on land that was actively being surveyed for housing development feels way too localized, too messy for a professional syndicate.
And that is the primary counterargument used by behavioral analysts. Organized syndicates prioritize risk mitigation above all else.
Right.
A mass grave is an enormous liability. If one body is found, they are all found.
Exactly.
The concentrated nature of the burials strongly points back to an individual who was geographically tethered to the Albuquerque area, someone who lacked the resources to transport bodies across state lines and instead relied on a familiar, accessible location close to home.
Which naturally leads us to the names in the case file. Because law enforcement didn't just have theories, they had a roster of incredibly viable suspects.
They had several strong leads.
And the name that dominates almost every conversation about the West Mesa is Lorenzo Montoya. When you look at his profile, the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming.
Lorenzo Montoya's geographic proximity to the crime scene is the first major red flag.
How close was he?
He lived in a trailer park, situated less than 3 miles from the 118th Street excavation site.
Wow.
And in 2006, before the development completely altered the landscape, detectives documented physical dirt trails leading directly from his trailer park to the exact perimeter where the graves are located.
He had a literal back alley commute to the burial site. He wouldn't even need to risk driving on paved roads where police patrol.
The logistics were perfectly aligned for him. He could come and go totally unseen.
That's terrifying.
But his behavioral history is what truly solidifies his status as a prime suspect. Montoya had a documented pattern of extreme violence against sex workers.
And that violence escalated over time.
It did. This escalating violence reached its peak in December 2006. Montoya met a 19-year-old sex worker named Sharika Hill in an online forum and lured her to his trailer,
Okay.
where he subsequently strangled her to death.
Awful.
But what Montoya failed to account for was that Sharika's trafficker, a man named Frederick Williams, had tracked her location.
So Williams knows exactly where she is.
Yes. Williams shows up at the trailer park, kicks in the door, and walks in on Montoya actively attempting to stuff Sharika's lifeless body into the trunk of his car.
Talk about walking into a nightmare.
Williams immediately draws a weapon and shoots Montoya to death right there in the driveway.
And that shootout is a massive turning point for this whole investigation, right?
The timing of Montoya's death is the crucial linchpin for investigators.
Because of when it happened.
Yes. Following that shootout in December 2006, the specific pattern of disappearances along Central Avenue abruptly ceased.
They just stopped.
In criminal profiling, the sudden, unexplained cessation of a serial offender's activities is almost universally attributed to one of 3 factors.
Which are?
incarceration, relocation, or death. Montoya's death perfectly aligns with the end of the West Mesa abductions.
It is the cleanest explanation for why the killing stopped.
It is.
But the investigation into Montoya didn't end in his driveway. When detectives executed a search warrant on his trailer, they found a piece of evidence that seems straight out of a horror film.
They've recovered a personal home video.
Right.
And while only a few still frames have ever been released to the public, the audio description provided by law enforcement is deeply disturbing.
What's on the tape?
The footage depicts Montoya in the presence of an unidentified woman who appears to be either completely incapacitated or deceased. The visual feed eventually cuts to black, but the recording device continues to capture audio.
And the audio is what haunts the detectives. You can clearly hear the distinct tearing sound of a roll of duct tape being pulled, followed by the heavy crinkling of thick plastic garbage bags.
The auditory evidence is consistent with someone actively preparing a body for transport and disposal.
He's bagging a victim.
Law enforcement publicly stated that based on the brutal efficiency and organization of Sherika Hill's murder, combined with the audio from that tape, it was highly improbable that Sherika was his first victim.
He'd done it before.
He operated with the calmness of an experienced predator.
So Montoya feels like the answer. He just fits so perfectly. But the deeper you dig into the APD suspect list, the more complicated the picture becomes.
It does get incredibly muddy.
Because if Montoya's death cleanly explains the timeline, how do investigators reconcile the physical evidence pointing to an older, entirely different predator? I'm talking about Joseph Blee, known infamously in Albuquerque as the mid-school rapist.
Joseph Blee introduces a profound complication to the single suspect theory. His reign of terror actually began decades earlier.
Back in the 80s,
Yes.
right?
Throughout the 1980s, Blee systematically broke into homes located near McKinley Middle School, targeting and assaulting young girls between the ages of 13 and 15.
Which is horrific on its own.
He operated with near impunity and evaded capture for decades until advances in forensic science finally caught up with him.
DNA testing.
In 2010, the city finally processed a massive backlog of untested rape kits, resulting in a definitive DNA match to Blee. He was convicted in 2015 and sentenced to 36 years in prison.
Okay, but going from a home invasion rapist targeting young teens in the 1980s to a serial killer dumping bodies of adult women on the Mesa in the 2000s, that is a significant leap. How did detectives bridge that behavioral gap?
They bridged it through evidence of behavioral escalation. Serial sexual offenders rarely remain static. Their compulsions often escalate in severity over time.
They need more to get the same thrill.
Exactly. By the time Blee was convicted in 2015, homicide detectives were already investigating him for the murder of a sex worker whose body was found near Central Avenue.
Oh, wow.
Blee's DNA was recovered from the inner waistband and belt of that victim, placing him directly into the local environment where the West Mesa victims were being hunted.
But the link to the West Mesa isn't just behavioral with him, is it? There is a tangible, physical piece of evidence tying him to the dirt itself.
There is. During the painstaking excavation of the 11 bodies, investigators utilizing forensic screens sifted out a small plastic tree tag.
A tree tag?
Right. The specific type of commercial marker used by wholesale nurseries to identify plant species. It was found mixed deeply within the soil of the burial site.
I have to pause here because the logistics of this are fascinating to me. How does a detective take a generic piece of plastic buried in the desert for half a decade and trace it to a specific human being?
It requires meticulous supply chain forensics.
Yeah.
Because commercial tree tags are not entirely generic.
They aren't.
No. Wholesale nurseries use specific die-cut shapes, color codes, and batch numbers to manage their inventory for local distributors.
Oh, so they could track it.
Exactly. Investigators identified the specific manufacturer of the tag, tracked the shipment batch to a regional distributor, and traced it down to one specific local retail nursery in Albuquerque.
That is incredible detective work.
It really is. Once they had the location, they cross-referenced the nursery's customer records and employee testimonies with their database of known offenders.
Yeah.
It was confirmed that Joseph Blee was a frequent, documented customer at that exact local nursery during the time frame the bodies were buried.
It's a microscopic breadcrumb, but it literally places a piece of plastic from his world into the graves of the victims.
Furthermore, when investigators searched Blee's residence, They discovered hidden caches of women's jewelry and underwear that did not belong to anyone in his family.
So he kept trophies.
This is classic trophy-keeping behavior. It's a psychological mechanism used by serial offenders to relive their crimes long after the fact.
And he also talked about the victims while in prison.
Wow. He did. While incarcerated, Blee allegedly boasted to a cellmate about his history of hiring sex workers on Central Avenue, and he referred to the West Mesa victims specifically as trashy.
So you have Lorenzo Montoya, who had a literal dirt driveway to the site and audio of a body disposal. And you have Joseph Blee, who has a physical piece of debris linking him to the gravesite and a house full of trophies.
Both incredibly compelling suspects.
The fact that the physical evidence isn't strong enough to secure indictment against either of them is maddening, and they weren't even the only ones looked at.
No, the task force investigated several others.
Who else?
They looked at Fred Reynolds, a local pimp who actually had photos of several missing women in his possession, though he died of natural causes in 2009.
Right.
They investigated Ron Irwin, a photographer from Joplin, Missouri, who frequently traveled to the New Mexico State Fair, though police ultimately cleared him of any involvement.
Okay.
They even interviewed Scott Lee Kimball, a convicted serial killer operating out of Colorado, but he denied knowing anything about the Mesa.
It paints a picture of a city just swarming with predators. But I want to elevate this conversation beyond just the names of the suspects.
I think we need to.
Because when you read the analyses on Reddit and true crime forums, the community consistently highlights a much broader sociological mechanism at play here. The West Mesa case is frequently cited as the textbook example of the missing staircase.
The missing staircase is an incredibly potent analogy for systemic failure.
Explain how that analogy works for people who might not have heard it.
Imagine a house with a staircase that has a broken, dangerous step.
Okay.
Instead of repairing the wood so it's safe, the people living in the house simply learn to step over it.
They just adapt to the danger.
Exactly. They adapt their behavior to accommodate the danger, warning newcomers to jump over the gap, rather than actually eliminating the hazard itself.
In this case, the missing staircase was the city's approach to its most vulnerable residents.
Without a doubt.
These 11 women were actively battling profound addiction. They were living in severe poverty. They were engaging in illegal street-level sex work just to survive.
They were on the absolute margins of society.
And when they started vanishing one by one in 2003 and 2004, the institutional alarm bells simply did not ring. If 11 affluent college students had vanished from the local university within 24 months, the National Guard would have been mobilized.
You are highlighting the devastating reality of the unspoken hierarchy of victimhood.
It's hard to look at, but it's true.
Law enforcement resource allocation is often dictated by societal pressures. Because these women lived transient lifestyles and were engaged in illicit activities, their disappearances were heavily rationalized by the system.
They just explained it away.
The assumption was that they had simply skipped town to avoid outstanding warrants or moved to a different city to chase a new supply of drugs.
Right.
Their lifestyle was used as the inherent explanation for their absence, completely masking the foul play.
This speaks directly to the online cultural interpretation of the case. The internet loves to obsess over unmasking the monster. They want to find the bone collector.
They want the satisfying villain reveal.
Exactly. But the genuinely terrifying revelation isn't that a sophisticated killer existed. It is the realization that systemic apathy provided him with a functional cloaking device.
He didn't even have to hide that hard.
Right. He didn't need to be a mastermind to operate undetected for years. Society's indifference handed him the perfect camouflage.
And the consequences of that indifference are not abstract concepts, They are lived traumas for the survivors in that community.
Absolutely.
The discovery of the mass grave catalyzed local advocates. A woman named Christine Barber founded Safe Streets New Mexico, which is an organization specifically designed to build the safety net the state had failed to provide.
What kind of work do they do?
They actively track sex workers, maintain communication networks on the streets, and immediately sound the alarm when someone drops off the radar.
And one of the most powerful voices on the board of Safe Streets New Mexico is a woman named Cynthia Vigil Jaramillo. And her perspective anchors the grim reality of this case better than any forensic report ever could.
Her story is incredible.
For context, Cynthia is the survivor who brought down David Parker Ray, the infamous toy box killer. In 1999, she was kidnapped and held in his soundproof torture trailer in Elephant Butte, New Mexico.
A horrific case.
After enduring 3 days of unimaginable horror, she managed to pick a padlock, escape the trailer, and alert authorities, ending a killing spree that may have claimed up to 40 women.
And Cynthia's demographic background at the time of her abduction mirrored the West Mesa victims. She was surviving through sex work.
Right.
When asked to reflect on the West Mesa discovery, she articulated a chilling truth about her own survival.
What did she say?
She stated plainly that she knew, with absolute certainty, that if she had not escaped David Parker Ray on her own, no one in the system would have come looking for her.
Wow.
No missing persons report would have generated a search party.
Just like the West Mesa victims. That was her exact quote.
Oh.
She survived, but she walked away knowing that the institutions designed to protect the public viewed her as entirely disposable.
Her realization perfectly links the sociological failure to the forensic failure.
How so?
The fact that society wasn't looking for these women in 2003 is the direct mechanical reason why the homicide detectives in 2009 had absolutely nothing to work with.
The delay ruined everything.
The delay allowed the bodies to sit in the high desert for half a decade, and the desert is perhaps the most hostile environment on Earth for biological evidence.
Let's delve into the actual mechanics of that forensic degradation. Here we are in 2026. It has been 17 years since the discovery. We have suspects with dirt trails, audio tapes, and tree tags. Why hasn't a prosecutor convened a grand jury and handed down an indictment?
It comes down to the complete obliteration of the forensic timeline.
From the environment.
Yes. When a body is exposed to the elements of an arid, high desert environment, the destruction is rapid and comprehensive.
Because of the heat.
The heat, but specifically extreme thermal cycling. You have bodies baking in over 100-degree heat during the day and then dropping near freezing at night.
Oh, that constant shifting.
This rapid expansion and contraction shatters cellular structures, degrading DNA at an accelerated rate.
So even though they have the remains, they have virtually zero trace evidence left on them.
Precisely the opposite of a fresh crime scene. Any footprints or tire tracks that the killer left behind were erased by years of wind erosion and seasonal flash flooding.
Swept away completely.
Clothing fibers decompose or are carried away by scavenging insects. But the most significant hurdle for prosecutors is establishing a legally definitive cause of death.
Because investigators suspect they were strangled, but how do you prove that without tissue?
You really can't. Manual strangulation is fundamentally a soft tissue injury.
Right. Bruising and things like that.
It causes bruising to the neck, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, crushing of the trachea. When you are left with only skeletal remains, proving strangulation in a court of law is incredibly difficult.
Is there any skeletal proof?
The only skeletal indicator is a fracture of the hyoid bone, which is a small U-shaped bone in the neck.
Okay.
However, the hyoid bone only fractures in about a third of manual strangulation cases.
So it's not a guarantee at all.
Not at all. Without a fractured hyoid, a medical examiner cannot definitively rule the cause of death as homicide by strangulation.
So even if everyone knows it was murder, medically they can't stamp it.
Exactly. And if you cannot medically prove how the victim died, securing a murder conviction against a suspect like Blee or Montoya is a near impossible legal challenge.
The killer was protected by the isolation of the landscape, the apathy of the system, and ultimately by time itself.
Time was his greatest ally.
But the investigation isn't officially closed, is it? The APD Cold Case Unit maintains that this is an active, ongoing file.
They are actively leveraging advancements in technology that didn't exist in 2009.
Like what?
Forensic labs are developing new techniques for extracting DNA profiles from deeply degraded, rootless hair fragments.
Oh, that's amazing.
And amplifying microscopic trace amounts of touch DNA from items recovered at the periphery of the site.
So there's still hope for physical evidence.
Yes. Furthermore, the $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest remains active, ensuring that the financial incentive to break the silence is still in play.
Though the passage of time has brought its share of heart-stopping false alarms, I remember in 2018, a construction crew was doing excavation work near the original 118th Street site and unearthed more human remains.
I remember that clearly.
The entire city held its breath, thinking they had finally found the missing women from that secondary roster.
The media response was instantaneous.
Yeah.
However, the state office of the medical investigator intervened and conducted a rapid carbon dating analysis.
And what did they find?
They determined that the remains had absolutely no connection to the modern disappearances. They were ancient Native American bones dating back to between 1100 and 1300 AD. It served as a stark, somewhat poetic reminder of how deeply layered the history of death and burial is on the Mesa. But it was a crushing psychological blow to the families who were desperate for modern answers.
Just a devastating roller coaster for them. It leaves us grappling with the modern legacy of this case. Today, the story of the West Mesa sits squarely at the intersection of forensic science and the desperate need for victim advocacy.
It's a somber reality.
In June 2020, city officials unveiled the Women's Memorial Park, built directly over the excavated site. It is a beautifully designed, 1-acre public space meant to serve as a permanent tribute.
The creation of that park is a profound act of geographic reclamation.
Right. Taking it back.
By transforming a site of clandestine horror into a space of highly visible public honor, the city is forcing itself to acknowledge the tragedy. It stands as a physical monument to women who were told their entire lives that they were invisible.
It is a powerful gesture, but it carries a devastating weight. As we conclude our examination of this case, I want to ask you, the listener, to confront a deeply uncomfortable question.
It's a tough one to think about.
When you look at the entirety of the West Mesa case, what terrifies you more? Is it the fact that a calculated predator expertly navigated the dark, isolated desert landscape to systematically hide his crimes? Or is it the fact that society's profound indifference handed him the perfect camouflage to do so?
It really forces an examination of our collective complicity.
Because it's easier to just blame the landscape.
Right. It is natural to want to channel all our fear and anger toward the individual, the anomaly who committed the acts.
Yeah.
But the West Mesa case demands that we confront the reality that the monster was only successful because the surrounding environment permitted it.
We let it happen.
The true terror lies in realizing how effortlessly vulnerable people can be erased when society makes the active choice to look away.
We all want the neat resolution. We want the sudden DNA hit, the dramatic courtroom confession, the satisfying click of handcuffs.
You want the movie ending.
But real life rarely delivers a clean ending, especially when the foundations of the investigation were compromised by apathy from the very first disappearance.
The value of studying a case like this is not just in attempting to solve the puzzle.
No.
It is in identifying the systemic fractures that allowed the puzzle to be created in the first place, ensuring we do not provide cover for the next predator.
The ultimate justice for the West Mesa victims might not just be handcuffs for the killer. Real, lasting justice requires a fundamental structural shift in how society values the lives of marginalized women.
Absolutely.
It requires building a world where no one can vanish without an immediate, deafening alarm being raised. Every single victim, Monica, Victoria, Selania, Doreen, Veronica, Jamie, Evelyn, Virginia, Julie, Cinnamon, and Gina, deserves to be remembered as a vibrant, complex individual, not just a tragic mystery buried in the sand.
Next time, we travel to India to examine the disappearance of Lalit Patidar, a case shaped by pilgrimage, unanswered questions, and rumors that spread far faster than confirmed facts.
Until then, keep asking the hard questions. Keep looking out for the people on the margins. Because as we've seen today, sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't buried deep in the desert, they are hiding right in plain sight.